Good morning and welcome to Gunner Shot. As you see, I have with me once again John Helmer and Brigadier Arun Sahgal. We're going to talk and rather continue our discussion on the Ukraine-Russia war and the twists and turns to peace in this conflict, which has raged for more than 3 years now. We all know 2 days back, the US and the Ukrainian teams met in Saudi Arabia. A few outcomes of that were that, look, USA has said we'll resume aid to Ukraine, start giving intelligence and some kind of a patch up after the Trump Zelensky spat. They also proposed a 30-day ceasefire plan. They proposed it to Russia. The Russians have not yet you know, responded. But in the meantime, as the talks were going on, you saw two actions. Russia tried to retake the Kursk salient, which was, the Ukrainian salient into Kursk, which they succeeded partially, and that salient is now contracted. At the same time, Ukraine carried out long-range attacks into Moscow with drones. In fact, the Moscow airports had to be closed also. So there's going to be a ding-dong battle of this kind. Whenever there's peace, there's going to be a spike in violence. That's the normal trend line anyway globally. So in all this, we have to see what's beyond this. What's transpired in the past 48 hours and where is this going? Because a lot of combinations are coming up and a lot of people are talking, the way they perceive it. In this context, uh, in fact, I'm delighted to have John Helmer and Brigadier Arun Sahgal who are going to give their perspectives of this whole issue. They might not be exactly the same perspective, a different perspective, and that's the whole course, that's the essence of the debate. With this, John, I defer to you. All yours. Please take it on first.
You don't defer to me. You'll just let me talk, okay? I'll get my word in edgeways, and then you'll disagree with me, which is fair enough. In the first place, I wouldn't describe what's happening in the last 2 days as ding dong. I'd say it's a ding and then a very small tinkle on the Ukrainian side. The drone attack on Russia with more than 330 drones had emphatically to have been targeted by the Americans and possibly by the British. Okay, so this notion that there was a suspension of intelligence sharing is nonsense. And it's made nonsense by the sudden announcement in the joint statement that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor, Michael Waltz, announced in Jeddah a couple of days ago now. What we now know, because Prime Minister Starmer has claimed considerable personal credit for it, was that he had sent Jonathan Powell, his national security advisor, to Kiev over the weekend. And Powell prompted Andrei Yermak, the sort of alter ego of Mr. Zelensky, the brain of Zelensky, the possible successor for Zelensky, to devise the joint statement. The joint statement was drafted by the British with cooperation from Waltz and Rubio. And so what was presented in Jeddah was the end of a play. And the play was designed by the British, the Americans, and the Ukrainian regime to, as Rubio described it, put the ball in the Russian court.
Yeah.
There's no sign in the joint statement, I come back to the language used, or in the 9.5-minute press briefing which Waltz and Rubio gave after the talks. There's no sign in that that the Americans have budged 1 inch towards the Russian side. In fact, every time they talked about security guarantees, they talked about security guarantees for the Ukrainians. That's a British American line, and the so-called 30-day ceasefire is one of these proposals, which, if the US side were listening, if they'd had a pair of ears, they would have heard for weeks and months and years now that no temporary freeze of operations, no ceasefire of this kind is acceptable. And the reason for that, pardon me, is the volume of cheating and violations which have been recorded in the past. So ceasefire without more substantial negotiations of a military kind are a non-starter. That doesn't mean, in my view, that President Putin will be impolite to President Trump. He will not be impolite. He will encourage Trump in his imaginings of what is being termed the American friendship with Putin. Not only does Trump repeat it, but this real estate hustler that Trump is sending to Moscow today or tomorrow to negotiate, Stephen Witkoff, and we can come back to what he represents. Both he and Trump speak of a friendship with President Putin. This is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, and it's arrogant on the part of a lawyer like Witkoff to claim he has a friendship with Putin. That's big noting himself. Witkoff, as a negotiator of an end of war settlement at this stage, is preposterous. You don't send a chap like that. Witkoff is, in fact, a negotiator of money inducements to the Russian side for a post-military settlement between the oligarchs on the one hand, US investors on the other. Witkoff's entire career as a Bronx lawyer, a Bronx real estate hustler, has been development projects which are on the border of fraud. And he's been charged with that before. He's also been the front man for Arab funds and investors engaged in real estate operations in the United States. He's been engaged in cryptocurrency business. Now, what does that tell you? You want to send a used car dealer to Russia to negotiate an end of war? That's not serious. It's revealing, but it's not serious. On the other hand, when we watched Rubio and Waltz discussing what they had agreed with the Ukrainians, they should have said with the British, with the French, and with ourselves, because that's what it was. Every 15 seconds, I worked it out and counted it. Every 15 seconds, these two chaps repeated either the name Trump or the president. And Arun, you said it in our last program. This reminded you of authoritarian states where the underlings and factota endlessly refer to the great leader and never discuss the details. It's always the great leader's great idea. This is the level at which Rubio and Waltz operated in Jeddah, and it's not a serious negotiating position to deal with Russia. So that's the way it looks to me. Pardon me, on the diplomatic and politico-military front. Second, with respect to the operations now, I mentioned the drone attack, which was assisted by the United States for targeting. Second, the Russian offensives have accelerated. Throughout Russia, there's been the celebration of this so-called pipe operation. That's to say, a special forces group, accompanied by two television correspondents, by the way, moved secretly and silently through a gas pipeline running for about 15 kilometers. It's an extraordinary achievement of a kind, and it resulted in their breaking out into the middle of Sudzha, where the Ukrainians thought they would stand and fight their last stand. Their last stand was hopeless, and they are now fully encircled. They can either surrender or die. In addition, the Russians, as you mentioned, Ravi, have moved into Sumy region, northeast Ukraine, which is not considered a Russian region, in order to establish a demilitarized zone that would block any further concentration of Ukrainian forces to attack across the border, either Belgorod or Kursk, uh, in the future. So down south along the line of contact, the daily casualty rate, and I think we talked about this before, is about 50%, 50% bigger, higher, more numerous than it was averaging in the middle of February. So the Russians are slowly but surely accelerating their westward offensive. They've also attacked the French. They announced that they had hit in Dnipropetrovsk a building in which 55 French officers were killed. This is widely published in France because of Macron's threats to put French boots on the ground. Well, the boots were just vacated, and a major series of attacks around the Odessa port, some of which would have been aimed at the British assisted installations that operate the Ukrainian Black Sea naval war. So the foot that we've described as President Putin's foot on the brake for the Russian offensive westward came off before the Jeddah talks, and the foot hasn't been put back on yet.
Oh, thanks. That's a nice way to say. Putin has taken his foot off the brake for the westward move. So what you are seeing, and we are seeing that a thrust by Russia to move westward. But as you see it, and the way I judge it, and what you see, it's only an incremental push. I don't know how far it will go. That we will have to see. But the major issue which you've made is that this whole story is going economically forward and with the economic bias. The way I look at it, it's more like an economic band-aid. Whether it'll stem the flow of the whole story, we'll have to see. And you also made the point that, you know, the US team has not been very serious at any negotiation, either politically or geopolitically. So that's the way you've seen it. That's fine. Uh, Sahgal, sir, your view on this whole story, the way it's going and where it should, and then we'll get back to John and see the
Oh,
course
sure.
forward.
Okay, thank you very much. See, I see stand now sort of a grand play being made by United States, European Union, England primarily, as a part of and Ukraine as some sort of a entrapment strategy. The entrapment strategy is based upon the fact is that the push was made to resolve the issue. The negotiations were open between Russia and United States. United States decided to, bring Russia back as an interlocutor, something which had not happened in the last 3 years. And then this whole meeting took place between the Russians and the Americans in Riyadh, where they talked about resolution of the conflict, moving forward towards this, talked about a number of issues, sanctions, lifting, and some consolidating moves being made, and leading to ultimate ceasefire and demilitarization, etc., as the ultimate goals. Now, what has happened is, like Ian Bremer was written in his blog yesterday or a day before, is that the whole idea of grandstanding against Zelensky in Washington was to try and make him understand that he has to agree to ceasefire proposal without making too much of a noise. The primary aim of the ceasefire proposal was that to take the pedal off from the pressure which was being put on by the European Union and to put the ball back squarely in the Putin's court. Now, the situation as it exists today, I may not, I mean, that's the way I'm reading it. I may be correct, may not be correct, but that's how I look at it. Is that the by agreeing to 30-day ceasefire, and not only although Zelensky was keen that we should have a naval and air ceasefire and nothing on the ground as yet, but then now with having agreed with the totality of ceasefire for 30 days, extendable, the issue has now gone to Putin. Now, how does Putin handle it? Putin has got four propositions in his mind, as John brought out last time. So, first proposition is that he wants a consolidated ceasefire. The ceasefire is end to the negotiations prior to that, and not the beginning of the negotiations. The two different things are there. The West wants ceasefire and then start negotiating on the terms, etc., lifting up sanctions, security issues, creating demilitarization, all that elements that they go with it. As far as Russia was concerned was that first you discuss all those issues, the territorial construct, how much territory, which will be the lines of the thing, what will be what is the security guarantee that Russia will get from people from the West, what will be the limits of the NATO's expansion in future, etc., and the fact that Ukraine will never be allowed to become a NATO partner. And from having achieved, and of course the sanctions and return of the assets, frozen assets, having achieved that, then the last step of that was to bring about ceasefire and start now discussing how to go about that particular perspective in terms of a territorial construct, as in terms of managing the ceasefire, etc., to international force for ceasefire. Now the dilemma for Putin is that how does he, if he agrees to the terms that are being offered to him now, he has not done total consolidation of a territorial consolidation at this particular point in time. So if his territorial consolidation is incomplete, he has no options but to play for time, and this heightened escalation or heightened the escalation of the offensives by the Russians, and the bold move which is being made in the Kursk, to me appears to be the part and parcel of a process in which, like John had last night told us, that the territorial consolidation is only 90% in one particular province, and it's about 65 to 70% in other provinces, and the offensives are continuing. That is an imperative, because the river line is the consolidation line for Russia to ensure its own security and to prevent uh, even, you see, everybody understands that even if the war stops, there would be this militant movement, terrorist movements, terrorist attacks like we have been seeing all around in this region. The second issue is how does the what role does the EU play, and on what terms is the what are the strategic priorities, sorry, of the strategic dialogue with Russia has to take place with Washington and the European Union. And here the China angle becomes very important, and they have to also look at it as how does it impact on this overall relationship with China. If you notice, in the last 3 days, they have had an hour and a half long discussion between Putin and Xi, in which basically Xi has told reassured Putin about the strength of the partnership, and they're going to go along with it. So the to me, this whole scenario is getting complex and in a multi-dimensional way. The at one level, this whole issue is being played out by the European Union, trying to create its own Euro force, spending say, $800 billion to upgrade itself and an exercise which will take 10 to 15 years. What happens to between that period? And the whole issue of America trying to push Ukraine towards a ceasefire, and the issue of the bilateral relationship which is between the United States and Russia, because as far as Russia is concerned, there at this point in time there is no convincing element of Washington's moves which can assure Russia of a long-standing or a change in attitudes. So if this is the scenario, I do not see how will Russia even accept this proposal. Now the dilemma for Russia is that if it does not accept this proposal, it shows bad intent. Now, how does he do it? Is now this is where this whole thing can come out. I can see some incident happening. I can see Russia simply trying to play for time, and how much time can they play for under these circumstances? I have no idea, because Rubio's statement basically indicated is that they would expect Russia to accept here and now kind of a ceasefire. They are not giving any latitudes to the Russians, and something that is something which the Russians will not accept. So we might be looking at a ceasefire, but I don't see that happening in a hurry at this point in time. I'll stop here. I'm sure there's a
Yeah,
lot.
thanks a lot. So I think you made some very telling points. You spoke of USA employing an entrapment strategy. It wants to entrap whom? The question is, whom does it want to entrap? It wants to
Russia.
entrap
Russia.
Ukraine. It
Ukraine
wants
is
to
a small
Russia.
bit there.
But right. So we'll right. And then the issue of the diametrically opposite positions, which both have agreed. Putin wants negotiations to ceasefire, whereas Trump and company want ceasefire and then negotiations. Right. So that is something I think which is a divide which they have to look at. And you invoked a very interesting thing of China. Where does China stand in this whole story? How does China help to reach a ceasefire or not? Because in my view, it's not in Chinese interest that a ceasefire comes about. As plain as that. And I can give a number of equations for that. Because the day a ceasefire comes in, and any kind of ceasefire which comes in, the Russia US equation will change. And any change, whether China likes it or not, USA likes it or not, or Russia likes it or not, will change the equation between Russia and China. There's no choice. It's a cause and effect kind of a story. So that is the next thing. And you said it's complex and multidimensional. I completely agree. And it's very clear that Mr. Putin is trying to use his military dominance at this point of time to get into a position of advantage and keep that threat going so that people are forced to negotiate first and then get to a consolidation. Be that as it may, what emerges very clearly is security guarantees. Whatever settlement happens, Russia needs a security guarantee and Ukraine also needs a security guarantee. While economically there is some sense to go the economic road because ultimately all wars are economic in nature, right? And what Trump is trying very clearly is use Steve Witkoff and people, the oligarchs of Russia, to see the economic angle and put an economic band-aid, if I may put it, and then see how to stitch the whole thing together. But the danger in this whole thing is not territory. Territory is one part of the story. This is my view. But the security guarantees, if we go back to the time 2014 to now and how things have panned out, why did why did this thing happen at all? It happened because Russia felt threatened. Russia felt threatened as it was an existential threat to them. And hence they posed this existential threat to Ukraine, right? So the security guarantees are two-way. And that is something which we have to see as to what will be the security guarantees which Russia will seek, what are the security guarantees which Ukraine will seek, and that I think has to be the midway point somewhere where people have to start negotiating. Yeah, it's a That's what I thought, if you could discuss, because that's the way those would be probably the way we go ahead for peace, to define what it is. And that I haven't seen coming forth. Uh, John, your views on this and how we go forward from here and all
Well,
that. Yours.
let me thank both of you for spelling things out the way you haven't. So I've taken a few notes. I also have to say parenthetically, some of your listeners have said that with my accent, it's a little difficult to follow me. I have to explain very quickly that my
That's
accent
okay.
was an Australian one that became a Massachusetts one, and ultimately somewhere in the Atlantic.
That's okay.
And
That's okay. That's okay. That's not a issue at all.
I'm very interested in the comments from your audience, and I'll try to respond to your questions and also their comments. In the first place, it's very obvious on the issue of security guarantees that Rubio, I'm sorry, I keep meaning to call him the Rube, as it means in English, rather than Rubio, because he
Okay.
behaved in such a naive and unpersuasively innocent fashion, an unprofessional fashion for a Secretary of State. Rubio and Waltz talked about security guarantees as having been discussed with the Ukrainians, but they only meant Ukrainian security guarantees, as
Yes.
if a so-called peacemaking force would be pointed eastward to prevent the Russians breaking out. That's not only a non-starter, it's a fundamental insult to the Russian side. And second, it defies the reality on the ground, which Arun has just confirmed, and both of you have confirmed. The reality on the ground is that Russia is winning. The reality on the ground is that the Ukraine is close not only to defeat in the east, but capitulation in Kiev and ceasing to function as a state. That means the United States and NATO are being defeated, and that's the urgency that the NATO allies plus Trump have to deal with. And that's what Starmer claims credit for in this so-called joint statement, the 30-day ceasefire. Now, the security guarantees can only be negotiated first before the ceasefire. And I think you put that very well. The time to a ceasefire that would preserve the Russian position, require the Americans to put up somebody serious, as I say, not a real estate hustler from the Bronx, to negotiate detailed terms. The Americans haven't come up with a politico-military team capable of doing that yet, and they promised that more than 2 weeks ago. They're still incapable of delivering, except to have fired General Kellogg from his position. There is time. I tell you, and I'm speaking entirely speculatively, but this has a precedent. The Russian side might offer an Easter ceasefire. Why? Because Easter this year falls for the Orthodox Christians as well as the Roman Catholic Christians on the same date, April the 20th. It's the first time in many, many years the Orthodox calendar and the Catholic calendar coincide. It's possible that Russia would offer a ceasefire between April 20, Easter, and May 9, the celebration of the 80th anniversary of the Russian Soviet Red Army defeat of Germany, to which a number of people have been invited, and possibly Prime Minister Modi will be invited if and when Mr. Putin comes to Delhi in April. My point is this: in the past, for Christmas, Christian Christmas 2022, the Russian side offered a Christmas ceasefire, which Zelensky rejected dismissively, as did his US supporters. So it's not unusual for the Russians to offer a ceasefire in relation to these two timeframes, April 20, May 9. Now that's 19 days. It's not 30 days, but it is a ceasefire offer. I'm not saying that anyone on the Russian side will consider it, but between now and April 20, there is a considerable amount of time in which there would be a total elimination of the balance of Ukrainians in Kursk. And the Kursk border would be sealed as a Russian border forever. Second, the movement to, as Arun said, consolidate the four territories, to make 100% Lugansk, to make closer to 100% consolidation of Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. That movement can be accelerated. I don't think it's possible to do it in the time between now and April 20, but a considerable amount of things can be done between now and then. And that would mean not only taking the Kremlin foot off the brake, but it would mean an agreement between Kremlin and general staff to put the foot on the accelerator. And that costs Russian lives, which is something that President Putin is very sensitive to. Public opinion is very sensitive to it, and the general staff are very sensitive to it. So accelerating carries a cost in human life, Russian human life, which the Russian side's been reluctant to commit. However, between now, March 10 or 12, what are we today? March 13 and April 20, we have 5 weeks. And as Arun said, and I think I reflected your views in a piece that I did subsequent to our last conversation, Russia's not interested in carrots, and Russia's not interested in sticks, those Trump carrots or Vitkov carrots and Trump sticks, but it is interested in time. And the clock is ticking in the favor of the Russian side. And with a little acceleration, the drive westward might be considerably successful between now and April 20. On the other hand, if you regard what the British have done, the so-called 30-day ceasefire proposal, let's call it the Anglo-American ceasefire proposal, which the Zelensky regime has put on the table, if that's a purely PR stunt to put the ball in the Russian court and make them look bad when they say no, there's a variety of ways in which the Russians will say yes without saying no and buy time. And I think that would be the tactical, political, military objective for the time being. As I say, to send Vitkov to Moscow to negotiate is not a serious American move, not a serious one at all. And it should be expressed as such. But however, the Kremlin and the foreign ministry are not going to insult Trump for the time being. The question of whether Russia determines that he's a president of peace, as the Rube said, or president of war, which is more plainly evident to me and to most Russians who've looked at the record of the joint statement, that takes time. As for the Chinese understanding, it seems to me that it's entirely appropriate that President Putin would talk to President Xi in order to discuss the options. They're the options we are talking about, and maybe they've got one or two up their sleeves, but that we don't know about, but I doubt it. So, and I interpret the Chinese position is basically acquiescence in the kind of thinking we are describing as the Russian position towards capitulation, and then the installation of a series of territorial and security arrangements, the definition and consolidation of the four territories, plus possibly Odessa and certainly Crimea, the creation of a deep enough demilitarized zone so that there will be no more long-range rocket, missile, or drone attacks on the Russian hinterland, and the peacekeeping force, such as it will face westward, holding the rump Ukrainian state. That's the fascist, race-hating, Slav-hating groups, the descendants of Hitler's Ukrainian shock troops, bottle them up in something like an Idlib combination in Lvov. Those are the primary goals. If President Putin described the current progress to President Xi and said, "What do you think about this ceasefire? I think we should do it in the sequence that we've just discussed and over a time frame that we're talking about." Then I think the answer from the Chinese president is okay. Now, on the question of whether what other criteria can we apply to the question of whether the Anglo-American proposal of 30-day ceasefire is realistic, let's look at the money markets. The American Stock Exchange response in the past few days has been to dramatically cut the value of stock market value, but more importantly, from a political point of view, the arms makers, Lockheed, RTX, which used to be Raytheon, and others, are all experiencing downward trend in their share price. Second, the Trump-related stock have lost favor with investors. Tesla has lost about 45% since the beginning of the year. The Peter Thiel Palantir has lost about 33%. And most important, Donald Trump Jr.'s Trump Media and Technology Group has lost more than 65% of its value since the beginning of the year. That's money, which is the only stuff that Vitkoff understands, expressing no confidence in Trump initiatives for the domestic economy and for the international economy that's connected. Of course, we're all bound to say that's wrapped up in not only in the war in Europe, but it's wrapped up in the way in which Trump is using tariff threats against Canada and all his allies. So the lack of confidence that Trump is bound to be feeling already is profoundly at odds with the posture of the Rube and Waltz in Saudi Arabia. And that pressure of market reality, money reality, is one that President Trump feels much more acutely than he feels from the media.
Yeah, I think you made some very interesting points. And I think the first point, which many of us are missing it out, is the fact there's a Trump contradiction or a US contradiction. Internally, they are in turmoil. Whether we like to say it yes or no, with Musk's actions and the market going down and all those things, they're internally in turmoil. And it's common sense that any system which is internally in turmoil doesn't make good external judgments. And the same thing applies for USA. So it's external judgment at this point of time by saying a 30-day ceasefire and we'll negotiate our way through this, all that. At best, you can say is they're buying time to get into something more, and prolong the negotiations and get some peace in, get some cool things down and go ahead. That's the optimistic way of looking at it. And I keep saying this. There's a very clear angle where the whole negotiations are being spearheaded economically. And you made a very interesting point that Russia is at this point of time pressing westwards, and it might offer a ceasefire from April 20th next month. And in 5 weeks, it will make a lot of consolidation. Yes, consolidation it will. How much westward it will go is a big question mark. And because Russia is, at this point of time, militarily, if I judge it, is at a point of overstretch. And the point of losing more people is not easy after 3 years. So having said this, Brigadier Sahgal, sir, your views on this whole story thing, the way it's panning out.
Okay. Thank you. On the issue of security guarantees, you see, the fundamental point we have to accept is the United States cannot offer security guarantees to Ukraine. Because if United States for the last 3 years has not offered any such guarantee so far, it cannot start doing it now. What it's trying to do is to offer it some kind of an economic consolidation guarantee by signing a deal with it, with Ukraine on critical materials, and working that out because then American presence will be there, and the security of the American presence, then securitization of the assets become some sort of a guarantee, which is an old trick which doesn't really work anymore. But that's some kind of a notional kind of guarantee which is being offered. The second element in offering security guarantees we have to also understand is this. The part of the process that is changing right now is one is the American position on the NATO and wanting it to spend more money, etc., etc., and the grand rearmament program of the European Union. The rearmament program of $900 billion or $850 billion or whatever be the amount is going to recreate a new element of security dynamics in Europe, which will have to be then reflected in any kind of the future guarantees which the Russians will seek. The Russians will seek guarantees based on that. Until such time those guarantees are not given, the Russian, China, and North Korea axis in terms of bringing up capacities, capabilities, and on their own, and all the other elements that come into play would continue. The third element in this whole game is that in the rather geopolitical game is the China, Russia, and the BRICS seeing the impact of the tariffs and other fiscal policies which the Trump administration is trying to follow, that is going to create its own uh, turbulence, and that the BRICS will then go in for a larger degree of consolidation. How that they will consolidate is a different issue. They will entering into bilateral dialogue, multilateral dialogue. We don't have to go into dollar currencies. In any case, the figure that I have is the global trade in dollars is about 60% or 30, 55%, and 45% is part and parcel of the third element coming out of that is, will euro become the alternate currency in the global trade market? So if euro becomes an alternate currency, Europe starts to become an important military player. And last and most importantly is this whole issue of nuclear perspective. There is a perception going around. There are a large number of articles floating around in the marketplace of the web that countries are now looking at nuclear weapons as a new securitization force. They're looking at nuclear weapons. So what happens if tomorrow Germany decides to go nuclear? Incidentally, this whole thing about UK providing anybody with nuclear umbrella is a farce because the UK does not control the nuclear weapons on its own. They are American weapons to be available to be mounted on British systems. The only country which has independent nuclear weapons is France, and France is too limited to do anything funny because two strikes and France is gone. So so the question is, this whole thing is a big drama which is being played out. So what we are coming back to is that the terms and conditions of ceasefire and demilitarization will have to be thought through much more, apart from the fact that every player in this thing trying to muzzle in his own greater interest to secure a better deal for himself rather than a consolidated deal for the security of Europe and for peace in Europe. So right now, what I'm seeing is that every player is trying to muzzle in his own deal in this whole game and try to create a better deal for himself rather than for Europe. And that is where the whole problem is occurring. And as long as that does not happen, it's not going to. And finally speaking, once sanctions are lifted from Russia, there's going to be a huge amount of economic change. Then what will happen? And in this whole sub cheese, the perception that you can put large amount of weapon systems in the hands of the European Union, which 40 odd countries, large number of small nations with 2 aircrafts or 10 aircrafts, etc., suddenly getting them on 10 aircrafts, so he has armed himself. That's not going to work. The United States guarantee as a during NATO was there because United States was a preemptory power. It was a major power. It has the resources and backed up by a huge nuclear capability. Once you remove that, conventional forces of Europe, we have seen in the two wars, did not make any difference. We saw what happened in the Second World War. We all, I mean, I have studied the military history as part of my staff college exam in the Hitler's invasion of Russia and the Russian counteroffensive, reading right up to Berlin. So the point I'm trying to make is this thing is nobody is at this point in time being faithful or really interested in the peace process. They are positioning themselves in a manner to get a good deal for themselves, and I do not think that augurs well for peace in Ukraine.
Thanks a lot, sir. I think you made a very important point that everyone is trying to get a good deal for himself and they're not looking at it collectively. But the way I look at it, they have to go through this process. All countries involved, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, Europe, Germany, France, or US, everyone will start looking at it through that and then come to a realization whether peace is possible or not. And they'll have to come to some kind of a understanding. That's the way, anyway, any process happens. But the problem in this process, the way it's happening and evolving is you don't have good leaders. You don't have good leaders who can force peace, and you don't have good leaders who can, put a vision. Because the lack of vision is apparent in this whole story, especially in the Europe and the Western construct. First, second, the terms and conditions of this ceasefire are very hazy. No one knows what's it, except that you stop firing. What are the terms and conditions? We don't know. And that too, what will be the terms and conditions of ceasefire in a divided Ukraine is also not known. And how Ukraine is ultimately going to be divided and governed is also not known. Will it be amalgamated into Russia or will someone accept that is also not known. Very thing. And then, of course, the interesting point which you made, with the situation where how it has emerged and Europe trying to remilitarize itself will change the dynamics of the security guarantees which will have to evolve. And to this extent, while everyone is talking of the security guarantees for Ukraine, I still go back to the first thing. What about security guarantees for Russia? If Russia doesn't get the security guarantees it started off with, then Russia has got no choice but to go along with China and do what it wants to secure itself. And in case China puts certain breaks in its whole story, which it has done, let me put it categorically, it has circumvented China by going to North Korea and used North Korea. Those dynamics we are not discussing today. We're looking more on this thing, but that's happened. So to that extent, while Russia is militarily dominant at this point of time in Ukraine, I think it's a bit hemmed in geopolitically. It has to manage uh, unstable West, which doesn't know which side it's going, right? Instability due to its internal problems and external issues. And on the East, it has problems with China, whether you will like it or not. Because all this for the whatever has happened for the past 2 to 3 years is only transactional, and for this point of time, I don't think it will go beyond a point of time. If you see the history of Russia and China, and if you go into the history of the territorial issues between Russia and China, Trans Amur. So we'll leave that part here. Let's look at the Western construct and see.
Well,
Um,
hang on just a
yeah,
minute. You say that you believe that Russia's hemmed in by the European countries. An elephant does not get hemmed in by a group of clowns. That may make for a circus amusement for children. But the elephant is never hemmed in by the clowns. And that's what we've got now. Russia simply has to proceed westward on a military basis and continue to fight the economic war that it's been fighting. It's not hemmed in. Instead, what there is, as Arun has just said, a kind of empty British posturing, a little Napoleonic attempt by the French to substitute for Trump with French nuclear weapons parked on a German airfield. These are posturings principally for domestic consumption and for that French fantasy of restoring French control in Europe. It's a fantasy. It's a Napoleonic one, and Napoleon was a much cleverer chap than this one. And he was defeated by the elephant too. So I don't see that Russia's hemmed in. Second, the issue for Russia is a PR one between now and after Witkoff's departure. And that's to say that the ball is not in our court. The ball's in yours. You are losing the war. We intend to prosecute to the capitulation of the Ukrainian military. If you want to talk details, we're ready for it. But don't send us this Bronx real estate developer to discuss money. That's not what this is about. We are prepared to spend time going through with between President Putin and President Trump. There may even be a phone call to gloss over this failure, because that's the way Trump likes to depict things, as pictures of success, of cards on a table in a television show. These, with respect to some of my US colleagues who continue to have great hope that Trump is capable of producing a peace, even when the so-called deep state, even when his own appointees are incapable. As you said, they're fighting among themselves. They can't agree on a negotiating team after 3 weeks. You've got appointees like Tulsi Gabbard, who's a very bright and intelligent person and able to execute the purges that are required by the president of the intelligence community, but not yet capable of putting any form of control over, let's say, covert or special operations at the CIA. And those are the dominant way in which the CIA runs its war against the United States on the Ukrainian battlefield. If Gabbard can't get control of covert operations, she's not there to execute a policy of peace with Russia. She's there to execute a policy of revenge and purging by the president, an understandable one. We could repeat this from one US bureaucracy to another, the intelligence community, the FBI, and so forth, the State Department, the Pentagon, and the National Security Council, all of those things.
I'm in a conference call. I'll just give you a call in 10 minutes.
These are the clowns. The elephant simply has to keep moving. On the other hand, it's a circus of a kind. So the process has to be portrayed for the public opinions which count to Russia. Now, the public opinion which counts to Russia is not in Paris, it's not in London, and it's certainly not in Berlin. It's no longer even in the English language. It's in India, it's in China, it's in Africa. And they may be able to speak in English, but English doesn't count. So the notion that the Americans will hold Russia to blame for rejecting a ceasefire is a presumption too far by the new and small Secretary of State. And he's simply repeating a line. The British have encouraged Zelensky and Yermak to to prepare for him, to convince Trump that last week's unfortunate events have been all resolved and everybody's back in tune with one another. That's the clown show. If it convinces them, it's of no material difference on the battlefield as the elephant moves westward.
Thanks a lot for that. As the
I
elephant,
just
yeah,
have
we'll
one
come to you, sir.
question.
We'll just come to you, sir. I would like you to sum up this whole story as to the way you put it and how you understood it. Please, yours.
No, I just want to know from John is what are the long-term risks for Russia? Because how long can it stand to
Hey, put it
prolong?
out, sir. Well, why don't you put it out? Why don't you put out what the way you feel long-term risk for Russia?
The,
Because
the,
there are.
the, the whole idea is that Russia is facing economic problems, economic issues. Is the perception of Russia being economically getting weakened can push the other parties, i.e., the Ukraine, United States, and Europe consolidated, to try and pressurize Russia? I understand your point of view. It's not easy to pressurize Russia, and I understand that. I understood from you the three elements of the American Russian power hierarchy: is important political element, the economic, and then the generals and how they are operating. The point is that can Russia withstand another year of war under these circumstances?
Oh, yes, I can say categorically yes. On the other
Okay.
hand, you're right. If we take it sector by sector, I'm not a macroeconomist, but let's say, and I think we've said this before, the macroeconomic stress in Russia is caused by a 21% central bank interest rate. And everybody but the president and the governor of the central bank acknowledge this. Oligarchs, small businessmen, everyone accepts that a 21% interest rate depresses demand, depresses investment, and has differentially greater effects throughout the economy, depending on whether one looking at farmers who can no longer afford to borrow to buy agricultural machinery, so more agricultural machinery is not made. It goes on, and if there's less
Yeah, it's a
agriculture,
circle.
there's a very clear set of criticisms of this domestic economic policy, which purports to be anti-inflationary, but is in fact having no impact whatever on food inflation. So we talked about that before. Food
Yeah.
inflation
Okay.
plus bloodshed is a very bad combination. But I don't see the major sectors of the Russian economy, the natural resource extraction sectors,
Of them.
what
Yes.
they are having to endure in some of them, coal, for example, significant cuts um, uh, in their profit margins, in their export volumes, and what have you. But the capacity of the Russian economy to adapt has been demonstrably successful. Second, the growth rate's small and not as good as targeted, but it's a hell of a lot better than anyone else in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. There is, I think, natural economic stresses for the presidency and for the economic policymakers in Moscow. And one of the serious political consequences of that is the growing pressure to increasingly planify or mobilize the economy, war mobilize the economy, which to many people looks like the return of Gosplan.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we go on without economic constraints.
So at the end of our discussion, or more or less as we come to the end of discussion, the basic issue that is emerging right now is that this peace proposal is just a proposal on the table which has not been thought through, It is tried, like I said, I go back again, it's an entrapment strategy, something which for Russia, which Russia is not going to buy. Russia has many dices at play. So at the end of the day, it's essentially what I will call a fishing exercise. And how do we manage? How do the world manage uh, uh, this whole drama being played out over the next couple of weeks? Like you rightly said, and I agree with you, that maybe the Easter ceasefire could be an option, which could be looked at, something akin to the Christmas ceasefire looked on. And by that time, if the Russians have gained enough territorial control to their satisfaction, maybe that can be subsequently be extended. That could be one of the lines, but that's not the only line, because the other elements will also have to come into play. So there is a series of negotiations which are going to go. I believe there is another meeting taking place between the Russians and the Americans again sometime in the coming week. We don't know what would that include. I do
Well,
not know how the proposals are read out to the Russians through the American interlocutors. Are they going to go there, or are they going to meet again? I don't know. But the question that is the fundamental point that comes about is this thing is, there are far too many moving parts in this whole game to come to any conclusion at this particular time. Even this whole notion of ceasefire can even be take off or not at this point in time. So I think we have to wait out, see more diplomacy at play, and again here the various elements which we have discussed: the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the Europeans, and the game at play, the economic angles, and etc. The infighting within the American administration to put up a cohesive face. All are the issues that will be taken on. Everybody will be noting these issues and making their moves. And I also see seeing from the old director MI6's video, that the British will continue to play these spoilers role from the back, and they'll continue to vitiate the atmosphere in terms of what they think is the right way to do it, and 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 do it as a guy who has no stakes in the game, but just as a spoiler stakes. So I think one of the lessons I would take is to take British very seriously, and not allow them to hijack the process. Thank you.
just to use a slightly different word, Arun, I don't disagree with the concept, but I wouldn't say that there's an entrapment strategy for Russia. I'd call it a booby trap strategy for Russia. And
Okay, booby trap strategy. Fine,
uh,
I accept that.
the Russians are not boobies, and everybody understands that there's the booby trap. It's lying in the middle of the road. You can either disarm it or drive around it,
Okay.
and so the Russian tactics are to drive around it. The British tactics are to make a booby trap look deceptively like something else. Deception operation is all the British know how to operate
Yes.
to deal with anymore. And that puts the ball back, if that's the correct metaphor, back into the Trump administration. How do you claim a rapid success when you send as your negotiator a real estate hustler? Well, the answer is and that's the negotiation this week in Moscow. But
Yeah.
Russia will not say that don't send this guy again. They will simply continue to say, we see the booby trap, let's move around it, let's give Trump as much as he seems to want, and at the same time move as fast and as furiously westward as the Russian army can go.
Thanks a lot. I thought we had a great 1 hour discussion on the way forward. One thing is very clear: the way forward is full of traps, booby traps, entrapment, and all that, in the
Booby trap.
best traditions of international diplomacy and relations, because that's how international relations play out. Everyone will play to his interests, right? And there are too many moving parts in this whole story for anyone to deconstruct. And I think as much as a 3 year war has taken place, the time to peace is also far away. It's not going to happen overnight. We have to go through all these hoops before we come to some logical conclusion. When I say we, the international community comes to some logical conclusion to say, this is where we'll do what we have to do. I think there's time to go. Uh, I must thank John and Brigadier Sahgal. Sirs, both of you have really, come out with some nice analysis, which will give fresh thinking to all of us. Because we've discussed this from both parts. I mean, let me put it this way. I largely think and agree with what John and Brigadier Sahgal have said, though at the time I came up with a contradictory note, but that was to play the devil's advocate, because one has to see in any game all sides of the story. And we'll continue to do this. Maybe next week or whenever, please do join us to our ongoing discussion on the Ukrainian war and the twists and turns to peace. Thank you.